situation in Ukraine. We welcome, therefore, the urgent debate on humanitarian human rights consequences of the Russian unlawful attack on Ukraine to be held later this week. It is the crucial duty of this Council to monitor and verify reports of human rights and humanitarian law violations. Mr. President, distinguished delegations, we are gravely worried about indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas, causing the loss of lives of many civilians and substantial damage to civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals. The Russian Federation should immediately halt indiscriminate attacks in violation of international law. We reaffirm our strong support for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Romania is in full solidarity with the people and the government of Ukraine. We call for an immediate cessation of aggression and the immediate withdrawal of the Russian armed forces. We will continue to support Ukraine alongside our international partners, and Romania is very committed to facilitate the safe entry of Ukrainian refugees, and we have taken measures to prepare for an increasing flow of people. The numbers are growing daily. We have also assisted many nations around the world and international organizations to evacuate their nationals or staff, and we will continue to do so. I also want to share our concerns regarding reports of hundreds and thousands of people arrested by the Russian authorities for exercising their basic rights to freedom of opinion, expression and peaceful assembly while protesting the war against Ukraine. All persons arbitrarily detained must be released immediately. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, a year ago we have announced Romania's candidacy to the Human Rights Council for 2023-2025 term. Our priorities are fundamental to the raison d'etre of the Human Rights Council, which is the meeting point of our promises of a safer future for our fellow citizens and for those without any protection. True to our solid support for human rights, democracy and the rule of law, Romania remains committed to work for their consolidation and enhanced resilience, taking into consideration also the impact of new technologies and the needed safeguards to prevent and fight threats. Our long-standing principled position to prevent and combat discrimination, racism and xenophobia will continue through preemptive positive approaches based on an inclusive agenda, education and strengthening the culture of tolerance. The recent adoption of the National Strategy for Preventing and Combating Anti-Semitism, Xenophobia, Radicalization and Hate Speech, as well as legislation introducing the study of Jewish and Holocaust history in high school, stands proof of our determination in this regard. The rights of women and girls remain one of our priorities. We approach gender equality and the fight against gender violence both as objectives of human rights and as prerequisites for social justice development, peace and progress towards achieving the 2030 Agenda's targets. One ministerial portfolio in the Romanian government is dedicated to equal opportunities. Romania will continue to display efforts for achieving institutional gender parity, for women's access to public life or decision-making positions, for eliminating violence, discrimination, stereotypes, and pay gaps. New generations depend on our respect for women and girls' rights and their realization. Freedom of expression is today under a pervasive attack globally, irrespective of countries' GDP, digital accessibility, or other historical or cultural determinants. With so many visible basic deprivations or moral suffering people are confronted with, the risk of overlooking the realization of the freedom of expression is high. Conflicts begin and are fed in with misinformation, hatred, call to violence online and offline, with repressing dissent, curtailing the civic space or media freedom limitations. The freedom of expression is a cherished right and way of living liberty. It is the essence and the guarantee of any functioning democracy and pluralistic and open society. and Romania will stand for its respect at home and everywhere abroad. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, these are our priorities for our bid to join this prominent body, and we will continue to promote effective multilateralism in the service of the rules-based international order and for the benefit of our resilient democracies. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Tiene la palabra.
I now call on representing the European Union, His Excellency Joseph Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Vice President of the European Commission. You have the floor.
We gather today at this 49th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council. The Russian Federation is pursuing its military aggression against Ukraine, including attacks on civilians. This is not only an attack on a free, democratic, and peaceful Ukraine, it's an attack on global stability and security, an outrageous violation of international law, and a violation of the basic principles of human coexistence. So let me begin by making it very clear the European Union condemns in the strongest terms Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine. We support the democratically elected government of Ukraine and its efforts to defend its territory and its people. We stand by the women and men of Ukraine whose courage and determination is an inspiration to us all. And we echo the United Nations Secretary General's appeal to Russia to stop its aggression and the High Commissioner's words of grave concern over civilian casualties and the human rights implications of Russia's actions. The Human Rights Council must address this crisis in all its aspects and do so now. While we are focusing on the war in Ukraine, we cannot forget other situations where basic human rights are being violated. Let me mention briefly some of them. First, in Belarus, more than 1,000 political prisoners have been locked up because they dare to protest peacefully, and independent media and civil society are being repressed. The Lukashenko regime is complicit in facilitating Russia's military invasion of Ukraine and should be held accountable for that. In Afghanistan, girls are prevented from going to schools, and human rights defenders, journalists, and minorities are hiding or fleeing the country in fear of their life. In Myanmar, the military ignored the results of democratic elections and uses violence against its own citizens. In northern Ethiopia, a humanitarian emergency is happening before our eyes, with credible allegations of massive human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. Moreover, we are seeing an attempt by some, Russia, to reshape the core principles of international relations. They seek to relativize key concepts of human rights and democracy, arguing that only states are sovereign, not people. If this revisionist campaign succeeds, we run the risk of moving back to an international order where might will be right. Let us remember that human rights are the law, are the international law, but they are much more than a law. They are about the dignity of human beings. They don't belong to any state. They don't belong to any system. They belong to the people, all people in the world. And on this I want to be clear. Human rights are universal and indivisible. They are the rights of all human beings. The European Union will not accept any effort to undermine fundamental freedoms or existing international human rights obligations. All members of this Human Rights Council and the United Nations Security Council must respect the responsibility and obligations that come with their membership. And this Council's mandate is to ensure that human rights are upheld everywhere and applied to everyone without any distinction between countries, and that means all human rights, economic, social, cultural, civil, and political, not only political, but also political. No country and no region has a perfect human rights record. No one of us is perfect. And that includes us, the European Union. Yes, we are not perfect. We have a lot of problems also. So I want to express the European Union full support for the High Commissioner Bachelet and to the independency of her office. Her office is the custodian of human rights norms, and the special procedures are the eyes and ears of the Council, and they must be allowed to do their work. Excellencies, multilateralism, with the United Nations at its core, remains the only way to achieve global peace, to achieve security and prosperity. And Russia's actions in Ukraine seek to make a mockery of multilateralism. And President Putin has shown his contempt for the United Nations Security Council. But no attempt by Russia, here in Geneva or in New York, to invoke international principles in justification will disguise the facts. The facts are the facts. And the action by President Putin and his government are the opposite of the principles on which the United Nations and this Human Rights Council are based. They must and will be held to account. I appeal to all United Nations members, big and small. I appeal to all of you to act with, to defend the principles and values of the United Nations at this Human Rights Council. Because global security only exists if it is based on human dignity and respect for universal human rights.
Thank you. And now I have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Belislava Petrova, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria. Welcome. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it's a great honor to address the high-level segment of the Human Rights Council. And let me use this opportunity to congratulate His Excellency Ambassador Viegas on assuming the presidency of the Council and wish him every success in this venture. For more than 15 years of its existence, the Human Rights Council has emerged as a fundamental pillar of the universal system for protection and promotion of human rights at a global scale. It has adopted numerous resolutions of major significance and has set up arrangements for the scrutiny of human rights issues and situations and the investigation into various crises. Throughout these years, Bulgaria has demonstrated its commitment to the respect and promotion of human rights and has always tried to contribute to the reinforcement and efficiency of their international protection, building on the values and principles of international human rights law and on the understanding that individual rights and freedoms are universal and interrelated. But as I'm speaking at this moment, a worse security and humanitarian military crisis is unfolding in Europe, challenging and threatening the rules-based international order we have been building over the past 30 years, and the very principles and values on which it is founded. As we have witnessed on multiple occasions, armed conflicts pose one of the gravest threats to the effective enjoyment of human rights, and the ongoing aggression against Ukraine is no exception in this regard. We condemn in the strongest possible terms this unprovoked military invasion of Ukraine, which represents a gross violation of international law. Bulgaria supports unconditionally Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. Bulgaria urges Russia to cease the hostilities immediately, to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, and to fully comply with its obligations under international law, including the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Bulgaria deplores the negative impact Russia's invasion already has and will continue to have on the respect of human rights and on the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. We fully support Ukraine's request to the Human Rights Council to hold an urgent debate with a view to considering and adopting appropriate measures to address the gravity of the situation. The Council should remain seized with the matter until the problem is fully resolved. Bulgaria remains committed to the fight against COVID-19 pandemic and the efforts to overcome its socioeconomic consequences. The respect for human rights is at the forefront of these efforts of the Bulgarian government. The goal is to provide all citizens with the best possible protection from the pandemic, including through access to information, medical care, vaccination, and social and economic compensations. School and university students, as well as other vulnerable groups, are in the focus of these efforts. International solidarity is also of crucial importance, and Bulgaria has contributed with vaccines, equipment, and other assistance to the efforts of many countries around the world to protect their citizens from the pandemic. Despite the pandemic, Bulgaria has kept its focus on combating all forms of racism, anti-Semitism, discrimination, intolerance, and hate speech. The institutions of the different branches of power work in close coordination to prevent and prosecute all such manifestations. The education of young people and the promotion of the traditional values of tolerance, mutual respect, and inclusion of the Bulgarian people benefit from a special attention. The act of racism, anti-Semitism, discrimination, intolerance, and hate speech remain rare in Bulgaria and do not go without appropriate reaction from the authorities and the society. Looking in the future, digital technologies are advancing ever more rapidly. The COVID-19 pandemic further accelerated this trend. This poses many new challenges in the sphere of human rights, and they require the special attention of the Human Rights Council. Likewise, the climate change and its universal negative impact on the humankind, including in the field of human rights, needs a more prominent place on the agenda of the Council. In this difficult period, the High Commissioner for Human Rights and her devoted staff deserve our appreciation and support for their relentless strive to advance the cause of human rights around the world. Mr. President, Bulgaria's first ever membership of the Human Rights Council successfully concluded last December. In 2021, the Bulgarian permanent representative in Geneva, Ambassador Sterk, served as a vice president of the Human Rights Council and a member of the Council's Bureau. During its membership in the Council, Bulgaria actively engaged in all initiatives related to the promotion and protection of the rights of the child, the equality of women and men, the empowerment of women, the rights of disabled persons, and the rights of other persons belonging to vulnerable groups. In a broader context, Bulgaria is convinced that human rights have a central place in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Bulgaria remains dedicated to these noble goals and to the highest international human rights standards. Building on the experience of the membership in the Human Rights Council during the past 3 years, Bulgaria is pleased to put forward its candidature for a membership in the Council for the term 2024-2026 and counts upon the valuable support of all UN member states. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Y ahora tiene la palabra.
I now call on Mr. Choi Jong-moon, His Excellency Choi Jong-moon, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, distinguished delegates, I very much appreciate this chance to address the Human Rights Council this year. I wish to thank High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet and the OHCHR for their tireless dedication to safeguard the human rights and dignity of those left behind. Last year, conflicts broke out in many parts of the world, which led to the suppression of civilians and attacks on human rights defenders. At the same time, the ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic extended far beyond the area of health. The socio-economic crisis generated by the pandemic has led to increased inequality, discrimination, and poverty. For its part, the Council held 5 special sessions in an effort to deal with these and other urgent challenges to human rights. The Republic of Korea believes that the Council has an even greater responsibility in such time of crisis. We start this year with yet another human rights crisis unfolding in Ukraine. The Republic of Korea strongly condemns Russia's aggression, as it is a clear violation of the principles of the UN Charter. For this reason, the Republic of Korea voted yesterday in favor of convening an urgent debate on the situation of human rights in Ukraine. The ROK condemns all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. The reports of civilian casualties are causes of grave concern. The use of force that causes innocent casualties simply cannot be justified under any circumstances. A rapid, safe, and unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need in Ukraine are urgently needed in order to protect civilians. The ROK is also closely watching the somber situation in Myanmar. The serious human rights situation is continuing even after the 1-year anniversary of the military takeover. We stress the need to keep monitoring the situation in cooperation with the relevant mechanisms, such as the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar. Meanwhile, the situation in Afghanistan remains worrisome. About 400 persons of merit who came from Afghanistan to Republic of Korea are settling in as members of the Korean society. However, let us not forget the people still in Afghanistan. The fundamental rights and freedoms of all Afghans, including women and girls, should be fully respected. Mindful of this, the Republic of Korea will pledge $35 million this year as part of its continuing assistance to mitigate the humanitarian crisis regarding Afghanistan. Distinguished delegates, COVID-19 is affecting every corner of the globe, and the DPRK is no exception. The Republic of Korea has been closely watching the human rights and humanitarian situation in the DPRK with a profound interest and concern. We wish to underline that the international community should continue to engage the DPRK for substantially improving the human rights and standard of living of the people in the North. We also hope that the DPRK will respond to our calls for a lasting resolution to the tragedy of the separated families, which remains as one of the most urgent humanitarian issues on the Korean Peninsula. Distinguished delegates, over the years, the ROK has brought the Council's attention to new and emerging digital technologies and their human rights implications. 2 resolutions have been adopted with broad support. As a follow-on measures to the resolution, the first expert consultations will be hosted by the OHCHR next week, with a focus on the application of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights to technology companies. We look forward to the active participation of all stakeholders. Last but not least, the Republic of Korea wishes to stress the importance of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Based on its historical experience, the Republic of Korea is firmly committed to advancing this agenda, especially by addressing conflict-related sexual violence around the globe. In this vein, the Republic of Korea, a strong advocate of the survivor-centered approach, launched the Action with Women and Peace initiative in 2018 and convened 3 international conferences so far to galvanize public awareness and political will on this issue. 3 decades ago, the late Ms. Kim Hak-sun became the first survivor of the so-called comfort of women to testify to the public her painful experience during World War II. The only way to pay tribute to these courageous survivors is to remember the atrocious acts perpetrated against them and restore their honor and dignity. With a great sense of historical responsibility, we will continue to heed the voices of the survivors. Distinguished delegates, the Republic of Korea will continue to play an integral part in the Council's noble work as a member of the Council. Our commitment to promote universal human rights lies at the very heart of our values. It would be an honor for us to stand here again as a member of the Council next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Agora tenho
I now have the honor to call on His Excellency Francisco André, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Portugal. Welcome. You have the floor, Excellency. Mr. President of the Human Rights Council, Madam High Commissioner for Human Rights, ladies and gentlemen, President, I would like to express my best wishes as you carry out your functions. As President of this Council, you will always have the cooperation of Portugal. It is an honour for me to address the Human Rights Council on behalf of Portugal and in Portuguese. I do so, however, with sadness. We're living through a sombre moment, perhaps the most sombre in Europe since the Second World War. Once again, we see war in Europe, a war provoked by Russia, a war that is illegitimate and illegal in breach of international law and the United Nations Charter. Its impact has and will continue to have serious consequences. Portugal vehemently condemns Russia's military action in Ukraine. This unjustified aggression must stop now. We manifest our full solidarity with the Ukrainian people at this difficult time. Portugal stands ready to receive Ukrainians who wish to continue their lives in Portugal in safety. And Eastern Europe at this time, we see flagrant violations of human rights by Russia, and it is essential to uphold international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law. Overcoming the pandemic gives us hope. This would not have been possible without international organizations, state, civil society, and the international community. We have all worked together. We congratulate the United Nations and the Secretary General, as well as the High Commissioner, for their commitment and dedication to human rights during this fight against the pandemic. If COVID-19 taught us something, it is that human rights are present in all aspects of our lives, even those that go unnoticed. Protecting human rights and mitigating the negative effects of the pandemic has been an ongoing concern for Portugal and will be so in the recovery phase. We adopted a large number of measures to support persons in situations of greater vulnerability, such as migrants, asylum seekers, older persons, young people. These measures sought to prevent and combat domestic violence and prevent manifestations of hatred, xenophobia and racism. At the same time, we committed to supporting small island developing states and least developed countries in their efforts to fight this disease through providing resources and training health professionals. With the start of vaccine availability worldwide, we started to support vaccination internationally. Portugal has already donated more than 5.3 million doses of vaccines to 12 countries bilaterally and through COVAX and the European Civil Protection Mechanism. Likewise, during the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union the first semester of last year, promotion of human rights was at the forefront of our work. President, it is more evident than ever to focus on multilateralism with human rights at the centre of our efforts. We must learn from the pandemic to build back better, moving to a world that is more equal, more caring, more participatory, and without discrimination, violence, hatred, or prejudice. Without human rights, all human rights, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social, there will be no sustainable development. In the answer to climate change, I welcome the recognition by the Council a few months ago that there is a human right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment, a right that was recognised by the Portuguese Constitution in 1976, in fighting terrorism, in managing migration flows, in fighting fake news, in dealing with the challenges of the digital world, including attacks on press freedom and bullying and digital violence. This is also crucial. Portugal will remain at the forefront of supporting and contributing to multilateralism and an international agenda that is deeply rooted in human rights. Portugal thanks the Secretary-General for the document Our Common Agenda, which we fully support. We also support the implementation of the Call to Action for Human Rights. We will continue to back the universal system of human rights protection and its independence, the mandate of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the treaty bodies and the special procedures. The 30th anniversary of the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action will be an opportunity for the international community to strengthen its commitment to the human rights system in the United Nations. President, I call on everybody to participate in the 22nd of March panel discussion on the importance of robust, efficient public policies, adequate resources and fully operational services to protect economic, social and cultural rights and mitigate the impact of the pandemic, contributing to recovery. Together with a large group of countries, we last year co-sponsored a decision to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Trust Fund to support the participation of LDCs and CIS in the work of the Human Rights Council. The Council needs all countries, large and small. We will continue to include civil society in all our actions. We condemn all types of reprisals and restrictions on civil society participation. In Geneva, we continue to preside over the group of friends on national mechanisms for implementation, reporting and follow-up on international human rights obligations recommendations. We are proud that our own mechanism, the National Human Rights Commission, which I chair, means that Portugal has its obligations to the treaty bodies up to date, and we have greater internal coordination on human rights, including civil society. Over 150 years ago, Portugal abolished the death penalty. We were one of the first countries to do that. And we seek universal abolition as a primary goal of our international action. We will spare no effort in promoting gender equality and are fully committed to the fulfillment of the human rights of all women and girls. Combating all forms of discrimination on all grounds is a common denominator in all of Portugal's actions. In that respect, I wish to highlight last year's adoption of our first ever national plan on combating racism and discrimination 2021-25 and our commitment with South Africa to the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration. The right to education is a vital human right for the enjoyment of all other human rights. Portugal supports the Global Platform for Higher Education in Emergencies and its Rapid Response Mechanism, an initiative fostered by the late former Portuguese President Jorge Sampaio. Portugal prioritises the protection and fulfillment of the human rights of migrants, and we wish to point to the mobility agreement signed last year by the members of the Community of Portuguese-speaking countries. President, 2021 was a year with new conflicts, heightened tensions and intolerance, the erosion of democracy and setbacks in the protection of human rights, especially for women and girls. This year, 2022, which has just begun, brings us the spectre of war and its scenes of violence, destruction and horror. The unjustified, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia is intolerable and unacceptable, and we call on Russia to end the military operation and the aggression, to respect international law. We stand with the people of Ukraine on the side of international law and respect for the Charter of the United Nations. We must act together to prevent human rights abuses and ensure that perpetrators are held accountable and victims protected and compensated. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Excellency.
Thank you, Excellency.
Pleasure to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Elizabeth Truss, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Welcome. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the UK is proud to defend and promote freedom around the world. We come here to the Human Rights Council to unite in this shared vision. Together, we have a moral duty to stand up to aggression especially when it comes from members of this very Council. We remain concerned about reports of violations from China, particularly Xinjiang and Tibet, and other parts of the world like Afghanistan and Myanmar. But today, we must face up to the urgent situation in Ukraine. As we speak, Russia continues with its illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. The consequences of Vladimir Putin's unjustified aggression are horrific. Russian troops are laying siege to once peaceful European cities. Tanks are tearing through towns while missiles hit homes and hospitals. Putin is responsible for civilian casualties and over 500,000 people fleeing, with the numbers still rising fast. The blood is on Putin's hands, not just of innocent Ukrainians, but the men he has sent to die. He is violating international law, including the UN Charter and multiple commitments to peace and security. He's violating human rights on an industrial scale, and the world won't stand for it. The UK stands united in condemning Russia's reprehensible behaviour. There are no shades of grey in this conflict. It is about right and wrong. This is President Putin's war against a sovereign nation. There can be no apologising or excusing it. I urge nations to condemn Russia's appalling actions and to isolate it on the international stage. Russia is now becoming a global pariah. Just last week, we joined over 40 countries at the OSCE in condemning its aggression. The Council of Europe also voted to suspend Russia. And at the UN, we joined over 80 members in backing a resolution condemning Russian aggression. Meanwhile, Russia stood alone in opposing it. This is the cost of isolation, and it's a consequence of Putin's war of choice. We must continue to lead a chorus of condemnation to show Moscow that Putin's ambitions will not succeed. This is a struggle, not just for Ukraine's freedom and self-determination, but for all our freedom and security. That is why the United Kingdom is proud to be at the forefront of support for Ukraine, economically, politically, and defensively. We were the first European nation to send defensive weapons to the country, and we're leading the way on humanitarian support. We've just pledged £220 million, including providing Ukraine with access to basic necessities and vital medical supplies for aid. And we call on Russia to enable unhindered humanitarian access into Ukraine and safe passage for civilians. Now is the time to come together with a strong response. We've joined forces with the United States, with the G7, with the EU and other partners to take decisive action through sanctions. Together, we are cutting out the vast majority of Russia's banking system from the global financial system. We're using our collective heft, making up over half of the world's economy, to cut funding from Putin's war machine. And we're delivering severe economic costs through these sanctions, as ordinary Russians are finding from queues at their local banks and rising interest rates. These consequences will only increase in breadth and severity as the conflict goes on. We are working to squeeze the Putin regime harder and harder by steadily tightening the vice. We're going after the highest echelons of the Russian elite, targeting President Putin personally and all of those complicit in his aggression. Nothing and no one is off the table. Yet we cannot pretend that this is the first time Russia has subjected Ukraine to such aggression. This Council has heard many independent reports about widespread violations by Russia since their illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. The Office of the High Commissioner has documented arbitrary arrests, detentions, intimidation and torture. Ukrainian political prisoners remain detained in Russia and Crimea, and many are subject to torture and denied medical care. Such abuses are far from limited to Ukraine. Russia continues to show contempt for freedoms people deserve worldwide. It continues to undermine Georgia's territorial integrity in breach of UN resolutions. It remains responsible for widespread violations in Syria. This goes hand in hand with what is happening to Russian people at home. The Putin regime is dogged by allegations of arbitrary detention, police brutality and torture. It continues to suppress freedom across the board, from free speech to freedom of assembly. Political opponents like Alexei Navalny continue to face grave threats. There are reports of people from the LGBT community being arrested, tortured and killed in Chechnya. And the Kremlin continues to clamp down on civil society, shutting two of its oldest NGOs, International Memorial and the Memorial Human Rights Center. The Putin regime has left Russia's moral authority in tatters. It should be ashamed to sit in this chamber. We know many Russian people feel the same way, which is why thousands of people have been arrested across the country at anti-war protests. But no matter how hard the Putin regime tries, they cannot hide the truth. At this critical moment, members of this Council must make their voices heard. Together, we can stand up to Russian aggression and back the Ukrainian people. We cannot rest in this task until Putin is stopped. Now more than ever, his regime will be held to account for its actions in Ukraine and across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Excelencia, señoras y señores.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, that was the last speaker on my list for this meeting. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. to continue the high-level segment. I hereby close the fourth meeting of the 49th session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Gracias.